All right, good morning, everybody. Oh, everybody, where is everybody? This is a thin group here this morning. Before we start, I want to back up a little bit. Last time we were meeting here, I think that's when we had this discussion, we were talking about the Gittites, people from Gath, because we have to be careful to recognize that none of these stories, none of the people in the Bible are black and white. And if we read carefully, we see things that point that out. And there was the story of the Gittites. Gittites are people from Gath, and there were 600 of them who were with David when he fled Jerusalem, fleeing Absalom. And there was one particular man named Ittai who is described as being an exile. And he wanted to go with David. David said, "You're already in exile. Why would you now exile yourself further, essentially, and come with me? Just stay here." And then we asked, who else was a Gittite? Well, Obed-Edom. It says Obed-Edom the Gittite. And Obed-Edom was the man when David brought the ark on the ox cart, and the ox cart tipped a bit, and the ark wobbled, and suddenly I can't remember his name, and he reached out, touched the ark, and he died. And David left the ark in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. And I thought, well, wow, that's really paints a picture if he left the ark with this man from Gath, a Philistine. But yesterday, Lisa sent me an article that points out that I had thought there was a second Obed-Edom, another man, because there is someone else, a Levite. Well, it turns out that probably this Obed-Edom, the Gittite, is actually this other Obed-Edom who is a Levite, because the town of Gath-Rimmon, which is in the tribe of Dan, was given to the Kohathites, who were a subset of the Levites, and they were tasked, the Kohathites were tasked with carrying the ark. They were the group where whenever the ark needed to be moved, it was the Kohathites who did it. And if you're from Gath-Rimmon, apparently you could be called a Gittite. And if you read the story about then when the ark was taken from Obed-Edom's house to Jerusalem, there's a guy named Obed-Edom who's one of the carriers. Seems like too much coincidence there for it to not be the same Obed-Edom. So probably he was not truly a Philistine from Gath. He was a Levite from Gath-Rimmon. So that's probable, not definite. But still, there were all these other Gittites who were with David and who had been Philistines, who then aligned themselves closely with David. So, okay, today we're going to start talking about giants. Who are they? But more importantly, why are they? Given the depth and the breadth of the scriptures, the giants are actually pretty minor characters. And that's to say they make cameo appearances here and there. But their impact really is enormous. We're all familiar with one iconic story of one particular giant, but there are others scattered throughout also. And the decisions that people made and the things they did and did not do because of these giants, they impacted history. And further, the things that God did in the face of these giants paint a picture. And I believe God used the giants to send us a message. The message is that God is bigger. The giants were just men. And with God, these men aren't to be feared. I see God sending this message to us multiple times, not just in the story of Goliath, but over the course of hundreds of years of history. And sometimes the message for the Israelites and for us is a challenging one. But let's start this morning first by talking about what a giant is and how big they can be. Are the giants, as we understand them from the Bible, even a true physical possibility? I think it depends on whether the giants were something unique in history or if they were the result of physical conditions that do exist now. Were they just different and there's no such thing today? Or are they like people who suffer from physical conditions today? In modern medicine, gigantism and acromegaly are conditions that are caused by the body producing too much growth hormone. And when this process occurs in childhood, doctors refer to it as gigantism. It's called acromegaly when it continues or starts in adulthood. And both usually result from a benign tumor, a benign pituitary tumor. And more rarely, the cause can be a tumor in another part of the body, but it's always the pituitary that's affected. Gigantism, which is the form that occurs in children, can be hereditary. It is extremely rare, with only 3 or 4 children per million being diagnosed with it. And symptoms include early skeletal maturation and distinctive facial characteristics like a prominent jaw and forehead, enlargement of the nose and lips and tongue, gaps between the teeth, unusually large hands and feet, excessive sweating, an enlargement of the heart and cardiomyopathy, and enlargement of other organs. And today, treatments include surgery to remove the pituitary tumor, radiation therapy to destroy the tumor, and then medication to control growth hormone production. But if left untreated, gigantism leads to heart failure, ultimately. But before that, osteoarthritis, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, sleep apnea, vision loss, and nerve damage. George Murasan, the guy on the left, and Manute Bol on the right were 7'7", are 7'7". They were the 2 tallest players in NBA history. Murasan has acromegaly, and Bol does not. And you can, just in their faces, you can see the difference. This is Sultan Kösen from Turkey, and he's the tallest person alive today at 8'2". He had gamma knife surgery in 2010 to remove the pituitary tumor, but he needs crutches to walk, and here he is pictured with his 5'9" wife. So she's as tall as I am. Oh, incidentally, George Murasan, the guy in the previous picture, was a patient at UVA. There was a neurosurgeon there when I was there named Ed Laws, and he was the world authority on pituitary tumors. And he treated him. Recognize this guy? That's Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he's 6'2". So not huge, but decent size, right? Well, here he is with Wilt Chamberlain, who's 7'1", and Andre the Giant, who's 7'4". This was on the set when they were making the classic film Conan the Destroyer. Andre the Giant's parents, were 5'2" and 6'2". But his father said, there's no evidence of this apparently. I couldn't find any evidence. You'd think Andre the Giant's grandfather might have made some news. But his father said he was 7'8". Well, Andre the Giant's acromegaly was left untreated. And he died unexpectedly of heart failure at age 46. Now, 7'4", that's a big guy. And he was, I don't want to hesitate to use the word healthy, but he did what he did his whole life. He was able to. But then we have Robert Wadlow, and he's the tallest man in modern history. He was born in 1918, and by the age of 8, he was 5'11". And he was 8 feet tall by the age of 17, and he died at 22 from a septic blister on his ankle and a poorly fitted leg brace, and he was 8'11". So here we see what 8'11" looks like next to 7'4" Andre the Giant. Not a real picture, because he died in he died in 1940, because he was born in 1918 and lived to be 22. Okay, so we take these examples of acromegaly, gigantism in modern medicine today. From the Bible, Goliath is described as being 6 cubits and a span. Well, if a cubit is 18 inches, and that's the shortest a cubit ever is, sometimes it's 20 inches, 22 inches. Well, at the shortest, at 18 inches and then 9 inches for a span, that's almost a foot taller than Robert Wadlow. That's 9'9". Now, the Septuagint and Josephus both say that he was 4 cubits and a span. 4 cubits and a span, not 6 cubits and a span. So that would have made him 6'9". That's more doable physically. But that's the Septuagint and Josephus. We have this other guy, Og, king of Bashan, says his bed is 9 by 4, which 9 cubits by 4 cubits, which it translates to 13.5 feet long by 6 feet wide. If your bed is 13.5 feet long, that suggests that you're 10 or 11 feet tall. And the Septuagint says the same thing. No difference there. What are your thoughts on this? I don't know where to come down. I guess I'm leaning toward thinking that the giants in the Bible had to be physically unique, that there's no such thing today. What are your thoughts? Although there's one thing that we'll talk about later that says something else.
I think also, to put in perspective, I think the average height for a male back then was like 5'5", 5'4". Now it's like 5'10".
Yeah.
So just think about how much, I know you just said maybe 6'9". It's still humongous. I mean, that's tall now. I mean, I remember when I was young, like 6'3", 6'4" seemed tall. Now it's like not uncommon to see. So just think about that height. The only thing I add as well is there's a guy named Paul White who wrestled as well, The Big Show, and I got to know him before he got famous. And you're talking about 7 foot, about the size of Andre the Giant, right? And from what he told me was, he always looked at his parents' religious beliefs, that it was he trusted in the Lord's will and the faith, but he talked about being ridiculed and being looked at, and some see it as a blessing, but in some ways it was a curse to always never be comfortable anywhere you go, no matter where you travel, how you get there, right? But always leaning into trusting that that was Lord's will for him to be that large. So.
Yeah, I think what you're describing, the Israelites looked at him physically, so that was their whole perception of him, was his physical stature. But what you're describing is that although he was large physically, he likely could have been a very ill person. Yeah. And, that's a good lesson for us, is that, don't judge by appearances, because it might not be the whole story.
Yeah, when we get to talking about Goliath, we'll see that there's something about that story that makes me wonder whether he was a physically unique or whether he had a pituitary issue. Paul?
You might have already came across this, but I actually was reading about that last week, just thinking about some of the things you were talking about. And I came across a Martin Van Buren Bates person who lived in the 1800s, late 1800s, who was 7'9", which they consider that on a giant. He actually lived to be 81 years old or something like that. So he didn't seem to have the health problems that all the other ones have had. So there's a gene or something out there that can let some people be that way.
Right. But 7'9" is not 9'9". Yeah, right. Yeah.
I may be wrong, but I think there were, it's almost like families or tribes that were giants, like the Israel was afraid of the giants, so it sounds like part of it may have been hereditary.
Yeah, and gigantism is hereditary. There are actually, there's a brother and sister in Egypt right now who hold the Guinness World Record for the combined greatest height of 2 siblings. What kind of record that is, I don't know. But, yeah. John, did you have something?
Yeah, that doesn't run in my family.
I believe that Goliath was unique amongst the Philistines because he absolutely, struck fear in the entire nation who had God on their side. And so he was obviously healthy enough to be a man of war, as it said, his entire life, be very good at it. He wasn't just some obviously big dummy. He could move and fight and all of these things. And he was so intimidating. But when the spies came into the land, they talked about an entire group of people. So there was, obviously, I think both situations, where there was people that were clearly identified as a group of people who were huge. I mean, they said we're like ants to them. And maybe this is where, Goliath's roots were from.
Yeah, and speaking of groups, there's actually some archaeological evidence of that. And this is, again, thanks to Lisa. She found this, that the Egyptians talk about a group of people known as the Shasu. And they're described in a letter of military correspondence between a couple of scribes. And they're described as living in Canaan and being 4 to 5 cubits tall, or somewhere between 6'6" and 8'6", depending upon you 4 to 5 and then how you measure a cubit. And this wall relief presumably shows them. It appears to show the defeated Shasu in the center being surrounded by smaller Egyptians on either side of them. And it's actually unusual, apparently, for the Egyptians to show anyone as being smaller or as being larger, because they were, dominant, and therefore they wouldn't show someone else as being larger than them. So these Shasu apparently were real people.
Yeah, and I think if you have 10 people in a group and 4 of them are extra tall, you might kind of forget that the others aren't as tall, and those are a group of giants. In the case of if the Israelites are coming into the land, also most peoples in those times were intermarried into their own type of people. So you have a group of people, like today I was just looking up the average heights per country, and like the Netherlands and Norway and Iceland are very tall, and then you have countries in Africa and Southeast Asia that are very short. So you have people that, if your average height is 5'2", 5'3" as a group, and then you come to people that are the upper 6s, for us that's not insanely tall, but for them that's 1.5 feet taller than them, plus maybe they just are more imposing characters, maybe they eat more protein and are just bigger, and you have this where we do that today, where somebody can come off as very tall even if they're just a few inches taller than the average, but somebody can feel very normal height if they're thin and kind of crouch over. So I see it, and when I've talked and thought about this in the past, is that they weren't, I don't think humans can on average be 8 feet tall. Like, that's just not, our bodies aren't meant to do that. But then you have Goliath, which obviously he could very easily be tall. You easily can be very tall. But even you look at like the pictures you've shown, you can be 7'5" and thin as a rail, or you can be 7'5" and super beefy. So you have there's just a lot of human body types. I don't think anybody could be 9 feet tall and accurately do much, but the perspective of somebody that's that tall would be a giant, and a group of people very, very easily could just all on average be 6'2" plus, and that would feel like giants.
Yeah. So were there a lot of people 8 to 9 feet plus tall running around, or were there a handful that were that big? It sounds like that's what you're saying. Or were there a handful that were that big, but others who were very large compared to most people? Yeah, good question. Well, so let's get into what the Bible has to say now. There's several Old Testament words refer to giants. And with the understanding that I don't know anything about Hebrew, and the notice that I'm not trying to bore you right out of the gate with our study, I'll do my best to keep it clear. And there are some chances that you're already familiar with some of these words. There's Nephilim, there's Rephaim, there's Anakim, there's Emim, and there's Zamzumim. Anakim. I'm just reminded that at OCBC about 20 years ago, I can't remember what we were doing, but I decided to be a character. I wanted to be Anakim Skywalker. So I squeezed myself into this little suit that for some reason Simon our oldest, had brought along. And it was an Anakim outfit, like Halloween outfit. And I squeezed myself into that. And I barely fit, the shirt came down to here. And the pants were really tight and came over to here. And nobody seemed to get it. That I was Anakim Skywalker. Anyway. I should have put a picture. No, I shouldn't have put a picture of that in the slides. I have one. But I think a little bit of background into these words and these names is important to understand the history of giants as best we can. And by understanding the history, we can understand why they existed and the message that God is sending. Now, the first word that we run across is Nephilim. Somebody read that?
Genesis 6:4, there were giants Nephilim in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown.
All right, everybody understands that perfectly, right? The first time we run across giants is in a problematic verse. No version is helpful in explaining this. In fact, many translate in ways that are distinctly unhelpful. Here's one example. Jason, you want to go ahead and read that too?
The children of the supernatural beings who married these women became famous heroes and warriors. They were called Nephilim and lived on the earth at that time and even later.
Yeah, okay, thanks a lot, contemporary English version. Okay, so how do we interpret this? Well, let's first look at the context. Can someone else read this? This is that same verse, but in its larger context.
And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and that they took them wives, of all which they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with men, for that he is also flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men which were of old men renown. And God saw that the wickedness of men was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually.
Okay. So, what do you think? Does anybody have any thoughts on this that you're really comfortable with? I don't see a single hand going up. Okay. Well, the best suggestion for this that I've seen that I'm comfortable with actually comes from Duncan Heister. And he says, what's happening here is Moses is describing conditions before the flood. And he says the sons of God, maybe literally sons of Seth, were tempted by and married daughters of men, sinners, maybe sons of Cain. And this is just a picture of how the world has always been. Moses is saying there were giants then, just as there are giants now. Moses says that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. Notice he says that, and also afterward. They died in the flood. Those who lived before the flood lived no longer than anybody else. They weren't supernatural, they were men. And the giants today are just as human and will also be dealt with by God, and so are not to be feared. Remember, this is This is Moses writing this, and Moses had a lot to say about giants later on. So he's saying the giants today are just as human as the giants before and are not to be feared. God's going to deal with them just like he did before. And this, I think, is the message that we're going to see over and over again in these accounts about the giants. Now the word Nephilim is obscure, and it comes from Nawfal, N-A-W-F-A-L, which means to fall or to cause to fall. So Nephilim could just mean someone who causes men to fall, like maybe a bully or a tyrant. And in fact, that is exactly what happened to the sons of God before the flood. They fell because of these men. The NIV and the ESV actually don't translate the word. They just leave it as Nephilim. So this word may not explicitly even have anything to do with giants. But I think it does, based on the only other place the word appears in the Bible. John.
I had a very interesting discussion with somebody once who believes that the book of Enoch was also part of the canon and was inspired. And there's an extrapolation of this in the book of Enoch. And it really focuses on that supernatural part of it. Really, it boils down to basically angels interacting with humans, and that's where these giants came from. And it was a real eye-opener that this person who was very, very, very learned put so much stock in the book of Enoch that this is part of what they believed. But anyway, that's just something that the Nephilim are they figure prominently in that, and I guess it's worth looking at. I looked at it. Obviously, I don't consider that to be inspired or part of the canon, but it is in there. So,
yeah, you kind of run into the problem of fallen angels and through that approach. There was a movie that came out, maybe about 10 years ago now, and it had all kinds of supernatural things going on before the flood. we didn't see it, but the previews were interesting. But here's the only other verse where Nephilim appears is in Numbers 13. Could somebody read that?
And there we saw the giants of the son of Anak, which came of the giants, and were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so were in their sight.
Okay. So the giants, or Nephilim, were the predecessors of the sons of Anak, the Anakim. So that, to me, suggests very, very strongly that Nephilim is appropriately translated as giants. Because we know from other references also that the Anakim were giants. And we'll come back to the Anakim or the Anakites shortly, but let's start to build a little family tree here. So we've got the Nephilim, and from them we have the Anakites. Now, before we leave, and this is maybe before we leave the Nephilim, just two additional notes. And the first one, I think, is further support for it being appropriately translated giants, and that is that the Aramaic word Nephil, or Nephilim, which is the plural, is almost identical to Nephilim, and it's the Aramaic word for the constellation Orion, named for the giant hunter of mythology. It's also, you notice this, isn't it interesting that they existed, the Nephilim existed both before and after the flood? Remember he said that in that verse back in Genesis. He said they were there before and they're there after. Well, how could that happen? Wouldn't they have all been destroyed in the flood? The only way I can see that happening genetically is if somebody in Noah's family carried the gene. I wonder if it might have been Ham's wife. I say this because we know that Ham's descendants populated Canaan. They included the Canaanites. The Canaanites were a descendant of Ham. And the descendants of Canaan were the Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, Girgashites, Hivites. Well, was Ham a son of God who married a daughter of men? Pure supposition on my part. But it's interesting that God, of course, would have known that the gene was lurking somewhere and that he would use it then again in the future. And hence our study today. All right, so that's really it for Nephilim. Any further thoughts on that?
That idea of the giants kind of being a stumbling block, or the Nephilim being a stumbling block for other mankind, kind of carries through with this Numbers 13 account as well. Like if these, that's what Duncan Heister was saying, right? And from the Genesis account, they were created there to be a stumbling block, but it kind of carried on because it's that same group essentially that they were contending with later.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Yeah. Okay, I think we'll hold it there because the next time we see giants in the Bible, we see 3 families of them. And we'll pick up with that next week. All right, thank you.